In the fall of 1868, John Wesley Hardin, a fugitive wanted for murder, was laying low when he got word that a group of 3 Union soldiers were on his trail. Not willing to be arrested and possibly hung, and not wanting to give the soldiers any chance of gunning him down, he ambushed them, killing 2 with a double-barreled shotgun and finishing off the 3rd with an old cap and ball 6-shooter. He was 15 years old, and he had just killed his 4th man. During the course of his life, he would be responsible for somewhere between 30 to 40 more killings, all of them, in his opinion, justifiable. So what went wrong with John Wesley Hardin? How did the son of a preacher man become one of the deadliest gunfighters the West would ever know? Find out as we take a look at the crazy life of John Wesley Hardin on this Holy Shit Did This Guy Really Like to Kill edition of Bloody Beaver Podcast. Hardin was born near Bonham, Texas on May 26, 1853, to a very respectable family. They would move south to Polk County, Texas, where John's father would open up a school and a church. And it was at this school that Hardin first showed his penchant for violence. He got into a schoolyard fight with a classmate, ended up stabbing the kid and nearly killing him. Talk about things escalating quickly. Most of the time when you're a kid, you get into a fight behind the school or in the locker room or whatever. That's all it is. You're just throwing fists at most. But there's always that one psycho kid with the crazy eyes that you know if y'all get into it, he'll try to stab you with a fucking pencil. That kid was John Wesley Hardin. And by the way, that's not the only time he pulled a knife out at school. On at least one other occasion, he threatened his teacher with a knife. Just, all in all, not the ideal pupil. Already going down the wrong path, it wouldn't be long before young John Wesley Hardin would take things too far and kill his first man. And that man was a free slave named Major, or Mage for short. The two had gotten into a friendly wrestling match when, according to Hardin, Mage took things too far, getting angry and threatening the young man. John Wesley also claimed to have tried to avoid any violence, but the next day Mage came looking for him and proceeded to start beating the ever-loving shit out of him with a large wooden club. And Hardin defended himself, pulling out a revolver and shooting Mage dead. According to Hardin. That's the problem doing any research on John Wesley Hardin. There's a lot of info out there on the man, but the fact and fiction is blurred together so bad that it's hard to see where the truth lies. And part of the cause of this is Hardin's own autobiography he wrote shortly before he died, titled The Life of John Wesley Hardin. He most definitely puts a positive spin on his life. He takes credit for some killings that probably didn't happen. And all of his killings, according to him, were in self-defense or just to protect his property. In his mind, he wasn't a murderer, but always justified. The whole, I never killed a man that didn't deserve killing thing. And I also think he did sort of view himself as a rebel soldier. He never served in the Civil War due to his young age, but a lot of people in the South still carried grudges against the Union. Like take the James Gang, for example. Even after the war, they carried on the, quote, fight, if you want to call it that, by targeting Yankee-owned railroads and banks. Which is something Hardin would never do, believe it or not. He wasn't your typical outlaw in that respect. He never held up stagecoaches or anything like that. He never robbed a train or a bank, but he would kill, and do so very, very often. Mage was just the first of many. And we'll probably never know why Hardin killed Mage. I'm pretty sure it's not for the reason that Hardin gave. What we do know, however, is that after killing the former slave, he fled about 25 miles away to his brother's house to hide out. This was Reconstruction Era Texas, and both Wesley and his father were concerned that he wouldn't get a fair trial for the killing of a black man. The Civil War just ended a couple years earlier, and the country was still very much torn in two. The war wasn't just a flash in the pan. At least 600,000 people died, and some modern historians say the toll reached as high as 700,000 in just 4 years. 700,000 people in 4 years. That's a lot of death. A lot of grieving widows and mothers. A lot of little kids without daddies. The South was defeated. Their economy was wrecked. And a way of life forever changed. And, justifiably so. As far as slavery goes, no one should be allowed to own another person as a piece of property. But people in the South were most definitely pissed off in the years following the war. It wasn't like the war ended and we all just went back to being happy Americans again. Reconstruction in Texas officially started on Juneteenth, 1865. The slaves were emancipated, the stars and stripes replaced the rebel flag at the Capitol in Austin, and for the next 9 years, Texas was governed by a series of provisional governors. And just like after any war, the victors, in this case the United States Army, set up camp and enforced the law. Texas wouldn't be readmitted into the Union for another 5 years. So yeah, we're not so much dealing with a modern day state here, but more like a defeated people who are being occupied by what they consider to be their enemies, a foreign occupation. The largely Democrat-ran Texas government was soon replaced by Republican carpetbaggers, and that's ultimately why John Wesley's dad urged his son to run. Just the whole idea being that he wouldn't get a fair trial, that these newly appointed Yankee officials would always be overly harsh on Southerners. And it was while hiding out at his brother's place that Hardin would ambush and kill those 3 soldiers. In his own words, quote, I waylaid them. As I had no mercy on men, I knew only wanted to get my body to torture and kill. It was war to the knife for me, and I brought it on by opening the fight with a double-barreled shotgun and ended it with a cap and ball 6-shooter. Thus it was by the fall of 1868 I had killed 4 men and was myself wounded in the arm. Now he's a for real wanted man. Killing 3 federal troops is not some small thing. So he went on the lam and started teaching school. Teaching, playing poker, drinking, and killing. A lot more killing, but also teaching. How crazy is that? His time as a teacher was short-lived, but can you imagine acting up in his class? I'm guessing no spitballs or whoopee cushions were put into play during his tenure. A few years later, he'd be arrested for killing Waco, Texas City Marshal Laban John Hoffman. Hoffman was in a barbershop getting a shave when an unidentified man rode up on horseback, dismounted, and entered the shop from the rear. He took a close look at the face of the marshal to make sure it was Hoffman, then walked behind the barber chair and shot the marshal in the back of the head, killing him instantly. The man remounted and fired 2 shots at approaching policemen and sped away. Hardin always denied this particular killing, so we don't know for sure if he did it, but he did get arrested for it. He wouldn't stay arrested for long, though. Much like Billy the Kid, Hardin was pretty damn good when it came to escaping captivity. While locked up in Marshall, Texas, he somehow obtained a revolver and deployed it whilst on the way to Waco to stand trial, killing the 2 Texas state policemen who were escorting him. And of course, according to Hardin, it was justified. The guards were beating on him and abusing him, but I'm also pretty sure not getting strung up was on his mind as well. Shortly thereafter, he'd get arrested again by a trio of Texas state policemen who proceeded to get drunk that night around the campfire, allowing Hardin to grab a gun and then kill all 3 of them. Now, this is an interesting case. He actually named the men in his biography. They went by the names of Smith, Jones, and Davis. And according to records, there were no Smith, Jones, or Davis killed in the line of duty as Texas state police officers. So did it actually happen? Or did it happen and they weren't state police but bounty hunters? Nobody knows about Hardin. And most of these events thus far took place in East Texas. Waco, Marshall, Livingston. But now, after escaping, he decided to change his locale. He had some cousins down in Gonzales, Texas, about 60 miles south of Austin, that he paid a visit to. He was contemplating heading to Mexico to hide out, but his cousins did convince him to accompany them up the trail to deliver a herd of cattle to Kansas. This would have been the summer of 1871, and what a bloody summer it would be. John Wesley would end up killing 2 American Indians on the trail. They tried to tax the herd in Indian territory, and he wasn't having none of that. He got into an argument with some Mexican cowboys as well, resulting in the death of 6 men, 5 of them at the hands of Hardin. Finally, they made it to Kansas with the herd, sold the cattle, and let loose on the wild cow town of Abilene. Following the Civil War, Texas was full of wild cattle just there for the taking, and back east people were craving beef. The railroads hadn't reached Texas yet, so the cattle had to be rounded up and driven all the way to the stockyards of Abilene, Kansas, where they could be shipped back east. Cowboying was brutally hard work and dangerous. You faced the constant threat of being killed by a stampeding herd, your horse throwing you, struck by lightning, drowning during a river crossing. Plus, when Hardin first went up the trail, you still had the threat of American Indian war parties. You had to cross Indian territory, which was populated by some of the worst criminals, and you were subjected to the elements. You slept on the ground, out in the open, rain or shine. Your diet would largely consist of beans and biscuits. So when you finally did get to the end of the trail and hit town, you let loose. Abilene, like all cow towns, is full of saloons, gambling halls, brothels, and whiskey joints. Given that most cowboys were, like the name suggests, mere boys, most of them teenagers who just left home for the first time, things could get a little rowdy. A lot of your famous lawmen made their bones while working these rough cow towns, men like Bill Hickok, Wyatt Earp, and Bat Masterson. Hardin was one of many young men who would hit Abilene and go wild. He would have been like 18 in 1871. By the way, he'd already killed a lot of fucking people to be only 18. They say your prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed until you're 25, and mix in the fact that he was drinking hard and likely a sociopath, you know some shit's about to go down. While in Abilene, Hardin went by the alias Wesley Clements, just assuming the last name of his cousins. And he also got a nickname, because every gunfighter needs a nickname. I feel like that's how you know you've made it as a gunfighter. 1, you're still alive, and 2, you get a cool nickname. His was Little Arkansas, after the fight with the Mexican cowboys I mentioned earlier that took place on the Arkansas River. It was also around this time that he had a run-in with famed, and not too shabby with the revolver himself, lawman Wild Bill Hickok. Hardin fell in with a couple of gamblers by the names of John Coe and Ben Thompson, and these men had recently opened up a saloon called the Bull's Head, which is fine. But what's not fine is when you have a picture of a bull with a cartoonishly huge erect penis painted on the side of your building as advertisement, which is what they did. I'm not making this up. They had a big bull's dick on the side of their building. The citizens of Abilene complained about the painting to the city marshal Wild Bill Hickok, and he told the men to take it down. They refused, so Wild Bill simply painted over it. This angered Coe and Thompson, who then tried to talk young John Wesley Hardin, Little Arkansas, who already had a reputation as a killer, into murdering Hickok. And to his credit, he refused, telling the men that if Hickok needed killing, they should do it themselves. And according to Hardin, he and Wild Bill would actually strike up a friendship, which I really don't believe. The story goes that John Wesley was carrying a gun, which was against city ordinances, and Hickok confronted him over the pistols, ordering him to turn them over. Hardin took both pistols out, holding the butt forward, and then did what's called a border roll. It's where you just really quickly flip your revolver over, cock it, and now your opponent's staring at the business end of your revolver as opposed to the butt. If you've ever seen the outlaw Josie Wells, he does this in one scene. Remember when he goes into that store and those men were assaulting that Native American lady? Then they recognized Clint Eastwood and told him to take his guns out? Nice and easy, slow as molasses, butts forward, which he does, and then quick as lightning, he flips them over and kills those motherfuckers. Yeah! It's a great fucking movie. Anyway, that's border roll. And that's what Hardin claimed to have pulled on Wild Bill. He said in his biography that Hickok backed down and let him continue to carry his guns in town. But here's the thing. Wild Bill fucking hated Texans. And he was no pushover. He was a seasoned lawman, veteran of the war between the states, and a verified badass. John Wesley Hardin wasn't the first, nor the last young killer to enter Abilene. I just don't see Wild Bill letting a kid half his age get the slip on him like that. And then allowing him and him alone to violate the town's ordinances. He couldn't have allowed that. He would have no longer been able to enforce the law in any capacity. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. I think Hardin really looked up to Hickok. He saw something in Hickok that he liked. Like Hardin, Hickok loved to gamble and drink. And he also was deadly with a six-shooter. So I personally believe that Hardin took the line and then later fabricated the story about backing Wild Bill down. And I know I keep talking about how I don't believe this or that. I'm not discounting how dangerous John Wesley was. He was no imposter. He really was actually crazy good with a pistol. Numerous accounts, not just his, testify to the fact. He was fast on the draw and deadly accurate. And he was totally confident in his abilities and had no moral qualms when it came to taking another man's life. So I'm not trying to do some revisionist history thing here. I'm just trying in my own very amateurish way to separate the legend from the facts. For instance, the myth that he killed a man for snoring, which I always thought was true until I started working on this episode. Damn it, why couldn't that have been true? It's such a cool, crazy story. And it goes like this. On August 6, 1871, John Wesley and his cousin Jip, still in Abilene, were staying at the American House Hotel and had just wrapped up a long night of drinking and gambling. And sometime during the night, Hardin grew highly agitated at the man sleeping in the room next door for snoring too loud. So he does the logical thing. He took out his pistol and fired several rounds through the wall to wake the snoring man up, because that's smart. Unfortunately, the snoring man didn't wake up. He was put into a permanent sleep by one of Hardin's bullets that struck the man in the head. At least he stopped snoring, right? So why do I think this is a myth? Well, in his autobiography, he made no mention of the snoring man, but said instead he woke up that night to a man in his room trying to steal his pants. He confronted the man who started coming at him with a knife, so he had to shoot him. Self-defense. And that's probably not the case either. Whatever happened, a man was dead and Hardin wasn't going to stick around long enough to try to plead his case with Wild Bill. He and his cousin, half-dressed, escaped out the window and got the hell out of Abilene. The local newspaper would report, a man was killed in his bed at a hotel in Abilene Monday night by a desperado called Arkansas. The murderer escaped. This was his sixth murder. Years later, Hardin would make the casual remark to a reporter, "They tell lots of lies about me," he said. "They say I killed 6 or 7 men for snoring. Well, it ain't true. I only killed 1 man for snoring." So with stuff like that and a Time Life book Misdirect in the 1970s to help fuel this urban legend. No longer welcome in Kansas, Hardin and his cousins would head back to Texas. And the hits kept on coming. John Wesley just couldn't stop placing himself in situations that required violence. Between October of 1871 and July of 1872, Hardin would get into a gunfight with 2 Texas State police officers, killing one and wounding the other. He wounded another Texas State official with a Derringer in Hempel, Texas, and killed yet another man in a gunfight in Willis, Texas. Then in August of 1872, he got into an argument during a game of poker, something he would do often. This time it didn't turn out well in his favor, however. It took place at the Gate Saloon in Trinity, Texas. A man named Phil Sublett was pissed about losing money to Hardin and aired his grievances with a shotgun blast, horribly wounding Hardin and almost killing him. He was so badly wounded, in fact, that he ended up doing a sickbed surrender to law enforcement just to get some proper medical care. And he was also thinking that this would be his chance just to clear the slate. Surrender, do whatever time they give you, come out a free man and start your life over. But once he found out how many crimes and murders they were going to charge him with, he noped the hell out of that situation real quick. He got a hacksaw smuggled into the jailhouse, cut through the bars, and escaped out the window. Shortly thereafter, Hardin got married to a Miss Jane Bowen, and he also got involved in a little something called the Sutton-Taylor feud. Blood feuds were common in Texas at this time, so it's only natural that a young killer like Hardin would find one to fit his fancy. The Sutton-Taylor feud had already been boiling for years. The name is a little misleading, though. While the Taylor faction would largely consist of the extended Taylor family, there was only one Sutton on the Sutton side, William E. Sutton. He was a veteran of the Confederate Army and a sheriff in DeWitt County, Texas. He was also a member of the short-lived Texas State Police. I've mentioned them a couple times earlier, and I mentioned the Reconstruction Era in Texas. It really was a lawless place after the Civil War, and the Texas State Police were created to curb all the violence and cattle rustling that was going on. They were only around for about 3 years. They likely did more harm than good. So here's the thing with the Sutton-Taylor feud. From what I can tell reading about it, this wasn't the case of good versus evil, or the good guys versus the bad guys. Although I will say I think I do sympathize a little bit more with the Taylor faction. Either way, both sides were up to a lot of shady shit. And once the violence got started, it would continue for years. As many as 38 people were killed as a result of the feud, and there could have even been more. So yeah, on one side, you got Sheriff and Texas Policeman William Sutton and another lawman named Jack Helm, along with about 200 members of vigilance committees, or in other words, vigilantes, some of whom were regular citizens just sick of all the crime in the area, and others being outright killers themselves. Vigilance committees seem to have always resorted to mob violence and lynching. So there's no process of any due law, no sort of trials, anything like that. Many an innocent man was lynched by vigilance committees in those days. And on the other side, you got the Taylor family, headed by Pitkin Taylor. Cool name. He was the brother of famed Texas Ranger Creed Taylor. Even cooler name. Creed wasn't just a Texas Ranger. He was also a veteran of the Texas Revolution, Mexican-American War, and the Civil War. This is a family of fighters. Unlike Pitkin, however, Creed would not take part in the feud. So it was Pitkin Taylor, his sons, and their many cousins, as well as the Clements brothers, John Wesley's cousins. And something that a lot of people get wrong is that Hardin was a cousin of the Taylor family. He wasn't, but he would become fast friends with them. So the whole feud started basically when two members of the Taylor clan, Buck and Hayes Taylor, once again, these Taylors knew how to fucking name their kids. Man, Buck Taylor. That sounds like the name of a guy who chops firewood for fun. I feel like a guy named Buck Taylor shits with the door open and enjoys riverboat gambling trips. Anyway, Buck and Hayes, separately and on separate occasions, both killed a United States soldier. Not only did these soldiers represent the much-hated Union Army, but they were African American. As cool as their names were, the Taylors of South Texas did not care very much for people with extra melanin in their skin. Hayes and his brother Toby killed 2 more Union soldiers later on that year. Then came the killing of Buck Taylor and Dick Chisholm on Christmas Eve, 1868. And this really was the true beginning of the feud, when the Taylor blood got spilled. 8 months later, a posse would ambush and kill Hayes Taylor. And then came the death of 2 son-in-laws of patriarch Pitkin Taylor. They were arrested on trivial charges, taken a few miles from home, and shot down. The posse would later say the men were trying to escape. This happened a lot with the Texas State Police and the so-called vigilance groups. A lot of people died, quote, escaping, when in all reality they were just using their badges to commit murder. In 1872, Pitkin Taylor himself was killed by ambush. He was drawn out into his field by someone banging on a cowbell, shot, and severely wounded. He'd managed to hang on for another 6 months before finally succumbing to his wounds. At his funeral, his son Jim Taylor and several other relatives vowed to avenge the old man's death. And this is about the same time that Hardin joined in with the Taylor cause. He wasn't afraid to do a little bit of ambush killing himself and soon taught the Taylors his ways. Hardin and the Taylors started taking out the leadership of the Sutton faction. They caught up to and killed John Helm in a blacksmith shop. They unsuccessfully tried to kill Sutton several times, wounded him once. In retaliation, lots of fucking retaliation in this feud. In retaliation of a Taylor sympathizer being killed, the Taylors laid siege on the town of Cuero, Texas. For an entire day and night, they fought it out there with the Sutton faction, scaring the living shit out of the citizens of that town. Just regular people trying to live their lives, and all of a sudden, their small town turns into damn Django Unchained. Taylors finally caught up with William Sutton on March 11th, 1874 in Indianola, Texas, as he was boarding a boat to take him to New Orleans. Jim and Bill Taylor boarded the ship and shot Sutton to death in front of his pregnant wife. Then they got off, mounted their horses, and rode away. The Sutton faction got even by lynching 3 Taylors, and so on and so forth. You get the picture. Lot of fucking death, lot of fucking killings. So one thing about John Wesley Hardin, when he wasn't out drinking and gambling, he would actually do all right. Whether or not this is just him maturing as a person, or maybe the influence of his wife and the responsibility of being a father, I don't know. But let him go to town, and he'd find a saloon. And then he'd find a fight. This would happen in the town of Comanche, Texas in May of 1874. There was a big celebration in town that day, and he and his buddies were gambling on the horses and drinking pretty hard. And the more Wesley drank, the more paranoid he got. By the way, how crazy is that a wanted fugitive can just openly walk around in public like this? There was law enforcement in Comanche, as well as other towns that he'd hang out in. But for the longest time, they just wouldn't fucking touch him. But on this particular day, there was a new lawman in town, a deputy from a neighboring county named Charles Webb, who Hardin was convinced was hired to either arrest or murder him. Never wanted to back down, he finally confronted Webb on it, and Webb denied having traveled to Comanche in search of Wesley. Tensions finally cooled a little, it seemed. Hardin's family and friends convinced him that he had too much to drink and he needed to go home, and he agreed. He sent his younger brother to go get the wagon. But that fucking deputy Webb, as soon as Hardin turned his back, Webb allegedly pulled his pistols. Someone yelled out to Hardin, he whirled, pulled his own pistols, and Deputy Webb went down, deader than hell. Another one bites the dust. Eyewitness accounts vary on this, but probably what really happened was that Hardin and his associates boxed Webb in and goaded him into drawing to protect his own life. Either way, John Wesley grabbed a horse and fled town. And this was sort of the tipping point. The townspeople were outraged. It was just one killing too much fucking violence. While Hardin had previously been praised for killing the despised and crooked lawman Jack Helm, Webb was actually highly respected and well liked by everybody. No longer would Hardin be able to just brazenly walk around in public in Texas anymore. He lost that crucial support of the local populace once and for all for this killing. He was now a marked man, and the Texas Rangers Frontier Division was sent in to squash the chaos. They weren't too successful at first when it came to the feud, but what they were successful at was putting so much pressure on Hardin that he'd end up fleeing Texas altogether under an alias. Some men that John Wesley had hired to take a herd of cattle to Kansas for him were arrested, then taken out and hung by a lynch mob that claimed they were rustlers. The new leader of the Sutton faction, Reuben Brown, was killed by Hardin, and in form, the Sutton faction caught up with and killed Jim Taylor, the new leader of the Taylor clan. John Wesley's father, wife, and children were placed under house arrest. He had no way to get to them. A lot of his allies were dead, and he was stuck hiding out in the brush for days at a time, constantly being pursued by vigilantes and Texas Rangers. Then his younger brother, Joe, was lynched. Man, you got to feel some sympathy for the parents of John Wesley Hardin. By all accounts, his father was a well-regarded minister and a former schoolteacher. Yet by 1874, he had one son dead and the other a notorious killer, surely headed for an early grave or prison at best. John Wesley would later write that this life, quote, drove my father to an early grave, almost distracted my mother, killed my brother Joe and my cousins Tom and William, left my brother's widow with 2 helpless babies, to say nothing of the grief of countless others. His father, Reverend James Gibson Hardin, did die in 1876 at the relatively young age of 53. His mother, Mary, would pass away in 1885 at the age of 58. So you got to wonder how much all this stress and worry affected their health. And like I said earlier, John Wesley was finally able to leave the area and make it to Florida, where he lived under the alias of J.W. Swain. And fun fact, it was in Florida that he would open up a small cafe that quickly gained popularity due to their unique coffee of all things. Before long, people were flocking all the way from neighboring states to taste the flavorful brew. John Wesley, now J.W. Swain, had named the cafe after his old companion, Buck Taylor, and his favorite horse, a sorrel mare called Star, for the white star shape marked on her head, and thus was the creation of Starbucks. Hardin would sell the cafe to the Baldwin family in 1898, and it continued to have sort of a cult following until the family set up shop nearly a century later in Seattle, Washington. And, well, the rest is history. Eventually, Hardin's wife and daughter were able to join him as well. He could have had a fresh start. It always amazes me how easy it was in those days just to disappear. As long as you don't run into anybody that recognizes you, all you gotta do is change your name and stay the fuck out of trouble. But John Wesley would flock to trouble like a fly to shit. And quick side note. Going back to episode 4 on Brushy Bill Roberts, this is why I don't think Billy the Kid lived to be an old man. Billy and Hardin were much alike in a lot of aspects. If let's pretend the death of Billy was a hoax and Pat Garrett let the kid go to start a new life under an assumed name, if that had actually happened, make no mistake about it. Within months, Billy would have popped back up on the radar, rustling cattle or something along those lines. These type of guys rarely changed. Which brings us back to John Wesley Hardin. He'd killed several people while in Florida. He was involved in the murder of a black man. The man supposedly tried to sexually assault a white woman and was placed under arrest. John Wesley, a.k.a. J.W. Swain, joined forces with the Southern Democratic Society, a.k.a. the Ku Klux Klan, and burned the man alive. He also took to cheating at cards. He and a friend were actually arrested for it in November of 1876 after having been caught with a marked deck of cards. He and his family would change locations several times while in Florida, often traveling back and forth to Georgia on business trips. And these trips consisted largely of drinking and gambling. Before long, if you could take his autobiography as the truth, he added 4 more bodies to his list. And this is where, finally, the long arm of the law caught up with Hardin. He had $4,000 on his head at this time. And just to put that in perspective, the often talked about Billy the Kid never had more than $500 on his head. Hardin was definitely one of the most wanted men in the West. And a certain badass Texas Ranger named John Barclay Armstrong was hot on his trail. Remember, it was the Texas Rangers who finally put enough pressure on Hardin to flee Texas, something that neither the corrupt Texas State Police nor the local South Texas sheriffs were able to do, and they were still after him. Barclay and his Texas Rangers caught up with Hardin on August 24th, 1877 on a train in Pensacola, Florida. Upon being confronted, Hardin cried out, "Texas, by God!" and tried to pull his pistol out, but it got caught in his suspenders, allowing the Rangers to knock John Wesley unconscious. One of his companions did manage to pull out his pistol and was promptly shot dead by John Armstrong. Hardin would later recount this tale differently, saying that he was just chilling, smoking his pipe when he was arrested. I guess they felt like his reputation as the deadliest gunman in the West would be tarnished if people knew he actually got his pistol stuck in his suspenders. Either way, John Wesley Hardin was now under arrest. This time he wouldn't be able to escape. He was extradited back to Texas and tried for the murder of Deputy Charles Webb, found guilty, and on June 5th, 1878, was sentenced to 25 years of hard labor in the Huntsville prison. He was only 24 years old. By the way, I was totally lying about the whole Starbucks thing. That definitely never happened. John Wesley didn't open up any cafes while in Florida, although he did run a saloon and he did do some horse trading. Back to the story. Ironically, a major concern for Hardin during the time of his extradition and trial was being lynched. We talked earlier about mob justice. It was a very real thing, and if it hadn't been for the particular Texas Ranger captain who was protecting Hardin, he likely would have been hung by one of the many angry mobs. It's interesting how much Hardin both hated and feared mob justice when he himself would so readily take part in it in Florida when it came to killing that black dude. John Wesley didn't like prison all that much. I mean, who does? Early on in his sentence, he and several other inmates attempted to tunnel into the prison armory. God knows what they were going to do when they got there, but it wouldn't have been pretty. They were stopped within hours of reaching it. While in prison, Hardin would team up with another inmate named Alex Voss, and the two would have an on and off again romantic relationship. They got into a dispute with another convict named Pennsatucky, who retaliated by locking Voss in a dryer, believe it or not, and a failed attempt on Hardin's life. Hardin finally broke it off with Voss by getting a tattoo of the phrase "trust no bitches" on the inside of his forearm. Okay, I lied again. Sorry. That was just part of the plot of Orange is the New Black. Hardin would try to escape several more times, though. He was severely flogged for his attempts. He'd actually get flogged on at least 3 separate occasions. He did a lot of time in solitary confinement where you're stuck in a dark cell and only given a diet of bread and water. After being punished numerous times for attempted escape, mutinous behavior, conspiracy, insubordination, and numerous lesser offenses, he finally settled down and started adapting to the prison life. He studied theology and actually started teaching at the prison Sunday school, and I'm not making that up. Can you imagine having John Wesley Hardin as your Sunday school teacher? I like to think his sermons started off nice and calm and just kind of morphed to something akin to Samuel L. Jackson in Pulp Fiction. Kind of like, hello, brothers, can I get an amen? Amen. Today, let's open up our Bibles to the Book of Ezekiel, chapter 25. There's this passage I like to read every now and then just to bring solace to my heart and in our time of incarceration. Inside the walls of prison, our bodies may be, but the Lord, amen, has set our souls free. So the book of Ezekiel, if you'd like to read along with me, goes, the path of the righteous man is beset on all sides by iniquities of the selfish and the tyranny of evil men. Blessed is he who in the name of charity and goodwill shepherds the weak to the valley of darkness. For he is truly his brother's keeper and the finder of lost children. And I will strike down upon thee with great vengeance the furious anger of those who attempt to poison and destroy my brothers. And you will know I am the Lord when I lay my vengeance upon thee. Fuck Abraham Lincoln. Fuck the state police. Say what again? I dare you. I double dare you, motherfucker. Say what one more time. Anyway, he also studied law, and he wrote a lot of letters to his wife and children. And if you read any of the letters, you'll see just how over and over again he exhorts his children to stay on the path of righteousness. He warns his son in particular of the dangers of alcohol and gambling. He actually gives his kids a lot of great advice, telling them to be moderate, control themselves, live good, decent lives, telling them to stay true to themselves and their Lord. He just couldn't take his own advice. Man, I got the same faults myself. He would suffer from ill health, often while in prison. He was once bedridden for 2 years, and this was due largely to the wounds he had suffered over the course of his young, violent life. He was described in prison records in 1892 as being 5 foot 9 inches tall and 160 pounds, with a fair complexion, hazel eyes, dark hair, and wound scars on his right knee, left thigh, right side, hip, elbow, shoulder, and back. Sadly, his wife would die during his incarceration. I really didn't touch too much on his wife, but in Hardin's autobiography, he does talk very highly of her. Other than being a wanted murderer and living a life on the run, there's no indication that the marriage was not a happy one. But the stress of raising 4 children while their father was in prison surely took a hard toll on Mrs. Hardin. John Wesley wouldn't do his full 25 years. He was pardoned on February 27, 1894, after serving 17 years. The 40-year-old, parentless widower, John Wesley Hardin, was released with a new suit and a state-issued check for just under $15. This would be the first time in 25 years, or since the age of 15, that he wasn't a wanted man. And things had changed drastically in the United States during Hardin's time in prison. The Wild West was no longer wild. No longer was Texas a lawless land with cattle for the taking. The Native Americans were already defeated and on reservation. Electric streetlights had been invented. Henry Ford had invented his first car. It would have been a lot to take in for John Wesley. I can imagine it took a lot of adjustment, and to his credit, he did hit the ground running. I mentioned earlier that he studied law while in prison. Well, upon his release, he took the Texas State Bar exam and passed, obtaining his license to practice law. Maybe now he could finally settle down, practice law, and enjoy the quiet life. Nope. Finding civilized Texas to be a little too civilized and maybe looking for a place he could brandish a firearm and play a little bit of poker, he headed west to El Paso. He may have had every intention of practicing law, but he was short on clients. I guess the majority Hispanic population of El Paso was reluctant to hire a fresh from prison, openly racist former killer as their attorney. Oh, I forgot to mention, after being released from prison, he would get married again, this time to a 15-year-old Callie Lewis. Yep, you heard me. 15 years old. What the fuck? The marriage lasted only 5 days before the bride headed home. Hardin biographer Leon Metz said this about Hardin and Callie's wedding. Callie was 15 and one half and acted every bit of it. John Wesley Hardin was 41 and feeling every day of it. Anyway, once in El Paso, Hardin started drinking and gambling and drinking. And on his days off, he'd drink and gamble a little bit more. He took up with a local lady of the night named Beulah Rose. Her husband, Martin Rose, a cattle rustler, had recently been killed by famed lawman and at the time chief of police in El Paso, Jeff Milton. Hardin claimed to have paid Milton to kill Rose, but later recanted. Who knows? I'm actually planning on doing an episode on Jeff Milton, and from what little research I've done on the man so far, he doesn't appear to be the type to kill for money. Seems like a really straight up law and order type of guy. I'll tell you who isn't shy about taking money for murder. Old Deacon Jim Miller. Jim Miller, who I'm also going to do a future episode on, was a creepy as fuck one-time lawman turned professional assassin who may have even killed more people than John Wesley. He was like the Wild West version of like a mafia hitman. Coincidentally enough, after Hardin's release from prison, the two would become friends. Hardin actually defended Miller in court, successfully getting him acquitted of murder. And Miller would end up gifting Hardin a fancy revolver. El Paso at this time, even though the Wild West was over, was still a rough and tumble town. Situated on the Rio Grande, right on the border of Mexico, the town started booming in 1881 when the railroad reached it. It soon had a reputation for violence. Gambling and prostitution flourished in El Paso even up until World War I. So there's no wonder Hardin would prefer this type of town over a more civilized place. One article from the El Paso Times states that Hardin, quote, was very quarrelsome and threatening, and that he could not stand to lose money, and on one occasion pulled his pistol and compelled the dealer to hand him his money back. There were many attempts to clean up El Paso, one of them being an ordinance against carrying firearms in city limits, something that John Wesley Hardin ignored completely. I mean, why wouldn't he? He'd been ignoring such laws his entire life and largely getting by with it. But what's good for the goose ain't necessarily good for the gander. His new girlfriend, Beulah, actually got arrested for carrying a pistol in city limits by Constable John Selman Jr., which pissed the drunken John Wesley off greatly. John Selman Jr. obviously was the son of John Selman Sr., hence the Jr. And John Selman Sr. was quite a bad man himself. A sometime lawman and sometime outlaw, he was born in 1838 and was a veteran of the Civil War. He then went on to do a lot of criminal shit, having to escape to Mexico as a fugitive of the law at one point, before finally joining his son Jr. in El Paso. So once Selman Jr. arrested John Wesley's girlfriend and fined her, the story goes that he and Hardin had words. According to some versions, Wesley ended up pistol whipping the young deputy. And as you can imagine, this didn't sit too well with Selman Sr., so he and Hardin had words. By one account, Hardin was said to have met Selman Sr. in the street and told him his son was a cowardly son of a bitch. Later, on the night of August 19th, 1895, shortly before midnight, Selman Sr. entered the saloon, walked up to Hardin, who was engaged in a game of dice, from behind, and shot him in the back of the head, killing him instantly. As Hardin lay on the floor, Selman fired 3 more shots into his body. And just like that, the notorious John Wesley Hardin was dead, having died exactly how he lived, violently. Selman Sr. was arrested for murder and stood trial. He claimed self-defense, stating that he witnessed Hardin attempted to draw his pistol upon him entering the saloon, and a hung jury resulted in his being released on bond pending retrial. However, before the retrial could be organized, Selman was killed in a shootout with U.S. Marshal John Scarborough on April 6, 1896, during an argument following a card game. So real quick, before we go any further, not everyone believes that John Wesley Hardin was shot in the back, as the conventional story goes. There was a reason Selman wasn't found guilty of murder. Some of the witnesses did confirm they saw Hardin go for his gun. And if you look at the picture of the dead John Wesley Hardin, the wounds you can see on the front of his body do look like entry wounds. Unfortunately, they don't show the back of his head, so I don't know. What's for sure is that Hardin, in his later years of his life, he just wasn't the man he used to be. That time in prison, being whipped into submission so many times, his failing health, and increased alcohol consumption, they were really taking the toll on the man. I found 2 absolute gems of articles, first published by the El Paso Times following Hardin's death. It's really interesting, and it sheds a lot of light on Hardin's mental state at the time. And it also sheds a light on just how the people of El Paso viewed him. So if you'll indulge me, I'd like to read both of them. The first one reads, "The people of El Paso breathed a sigh of relief yesterday morning when they read in the Times the story of the killing of John Wesley Hardin at the Acme Monday night by John Selman. Some said it looked like murder, but all agreed that it was what they had been expecting. 3 out of every 4 persons met said Captain Selman had done the proper thing in killing Hardin and taking no chances, while the 4th would admit that Hardin's death was a good thing for El Paso, but they thought he should have been given a showing. And the second article, titled An Interesting Chat About John Wesley Hardin, was basically an interview with his landlady, and it goes like this. The late John Wesley Hardin's name is known from New York to San Francisco. His earthly career was marked by a trail of blood. To some very few people, he talked freely and unreservedly of his past and of his future. While rooming at the Herndon Lodging House on East Overland Street, over the Tribune office, he was not slow to discover and appreciate the pluck and courage of the landlady, Miss Williams, who did not hesitate to warn him that unless he mended his ways, his career would end violently. When John Wesley discovered that Mrs. Williams was not afraid of him, not even a little bit, he felt a high admiration for her and would often sit for hours talking to her of his past life and his hopes for the future. And knowing that anything Miss Williams would be willing to tell about those conversations would prove interesting reading, a Times reporter called upon Miss Williams yesterday and found her a pleasant, vivacious little woman and a bright, interesting talker. She did not like the idea of talking for the papers, but her innate desire to be accommodating and her natural vivacity overcame her modest scruples about being quoted in the public prints, and she was soon chatting away at a lively rate. It is difficult, she said, to describe how Mr. Hardin's presence influenced me. I did not hesitate to talk saucy to him when he got drunk and damaged my furniture, and yet I know I feared him, for I would feel my very bones chill when he looked at me with those darting little serpentine eyes. He would bring his whiskey up here by the gallon, and I could hear him at all hours of the day and night stirring his toddy. But I never did see him staggering drunk, and can only tell he was drunk by his extreme politeness and the particular snake-like glitter of his eyes. I never talked with him except in the presence of Miss Morose, and he never swore in my presence. He told me one day last January that he married a 16-year-old girl at Tyler, Texas, and quit her the next day. He laughed gleefully as he told me how he frightened the young bride into returning home and telling her parents that it was all her fault, that she did not love him and could not live with him. Yes, he frequently talked to me about his book, The History of His Life, that he was writing. One day I walked in and asked, "What are you doing now? Telling how you killed a man or how you stole a horse?" He replied that he was stealing a horse just then. He commenced talking about his history and said he had just one more man to kill. He said that there was living near here a man who had assisted in lynching his brother at Comanche, and that he intended to go to the man's house, call him to the door, and kill him, and no one would ever know who did it. He said that hereafter he intended to do his work on the slide, as other people did. He declared to me that he had no confidence in human nature, that the human heart was rotten and everything that was living was deceitful. And he made me shudder when he said I would not trust my own mother, but would watch her just as I would watch everybody else. I tell you, those two, Mr. Hardin and Mrs. Morose, made life a burden for me, and I tried in every way to get them out of the house before they finally left. Hardin would walk the hall for hours at night with a pistol in hand. I think he was crazy with fear, for no matter who knocked at his door, he would spring behind a table where a pistol was lying even before he said come in, and he never allowed a living soul to enter his room while he was sitting down. Miss Morose also carried a gun in some kind of stationary pocket in the folds of her dress, and I tell you, she could pull it out in a hurry. The night I had Hardin arrested, I went to the room where they were quarreling, and she drew a gun on him. But I grabbed it and told her, for God's sakes, do not have a killing in my house. Hardin would have shot her then and there, but his pistol was on the table across the room, and I believe he feared to attempt to reach it. Mrs. Morose then followed me to the back steps and said, "Mrs. Williams, I hate to do it in your house, but I must kill that man tonight or he will kill me." I told her that if she didn't mind, he would kill her whenever she attempted to shoot him. She said that he would wait until he went to sleep and then put the pistol to his head and blow his brains out. He told me that night in her presence that he intended to kill her. Then she handed me a letter that he snatched right out of my hands. She said right there in front of him, "Mrs. Williams, that letter is one he forced me to write, saying that I had committed suicide. He wanted the letter found on me after he killed me." I was so completely put out that I just told him, please get out of my house and kill each other elsewhere. A few nights afterward, he came to me and said he was going to town to get a $500 bill taken out on a pistol. He said he expected to be shot all to pieces. Bursting into tears, he said, to think that old John Wesley Hardin should come to El Paso to get killed. I persuaded him not to go. Yes, Mr. Hardin was certainly a quick man with a gun. I have seen him unload his guns, put them in his pockets, walk across the room, then suddenly spring to one side, facing, and quick as a flash, he would have a gun in each hand, clicking so fast the click sounded like a rattle machine. He would place his guns inside his breeches in the front with the muzzles out. Then he would jerk them out by the muzzle and with a toss as quick as lightning grasp them by the handle and have them clicking in unison. He showed me how he once killed 2 men that way. They demanded his guns and he extended them, one in each hand, holding the muzzle as if to surrender. And when the men reached for the guns, he tossed the pistols over, catching the handles, and killed both men while their hands were still yet extended for their weapons. Oh, he was a wonderful man. He practiced with his guns daily, and I'd like to see him handle them when they were empty. And thus Miss Williams chatted on in her own interesting and vivacious manner. There you have it. John Wesley Hardin was born into a good family. He married a good woman, was a capable cattleman when the mood struck him, and he was also extremely formidable with both pistol and shotgun. Many a man fell dead in a cloud of black powder smoke when squaring up against John Wesley Hardin. Unfortunately, there was one opponent he couldn't outgun: himself. He was his own worst enemy. He once wrote, "Readers, you see what drink and passion will do. If you wish to be successful in life, be temperate and control your passions. If you don't, ruin and death is the result." If only he had taken his own advice. The Sutton-Taylor feud would continue after Hardin fled to Florida, but not for much longer. Hostilities would finally cease in 1877 after Texas Ranger Captain Jesse Lee Hall led a force of Rangers to Cuero, Texas to finally end the violence. John Wesley Hardin's child bride would remarry a few years later to a man much closer to her own age, and she lived a long life. She'd die in 1963 at the age of 83. So if you're over the age of 56, you were alive at the same time the wife of a gunfighter was alive. I'm telling you, this shit wasn't that long ago. The Abilene Marshal that Hardin supposedly backed down, Wild Bill Hickok, would suffer the same fate as John Wesley, being shot in the back of the head while playing poker in Deadwood, South Dakota. All right, that's about all I have on John Wesley Hardin. Stay tuned. Up next, I'm going to do a spooky Halloween episode. Just to get in the Halloween spirit, I got a couple of creepy Old West tales for you. Try not to get any blood feuds this week. Don't marry a 15-year-old. And for God's sakes, don't get drunk and kill a sheriff's deputy. And definitely don't get trust no bitches tattooed on you. It's unseemly.